Every once in a while, a game comes around, and everyone I know recommends it to me. And what happens usually is I kind of go, alright, fine, I'll play the game, play it. Turns out it's not really for me. Then I kind of, it's there in the Steam library, uninstalled, haunting me forever. And Disco Elysium almost became one of those games for me because I only really played it on the recommendation of friend. And this will be a recurring theme. I play games a lot on the recommendation of friends because, I don't know, like that's just how you hear about games, I suppose. But it didn't become that, despite initially having some difficulty connecting with the game itself. I kind of came around on it, and actually, I kind of think it might be the closest thing to a perfect role-playing game I've ever played. When you look at how I started the video, especially talking about like the games that taunt me in the side of the Steam window, I'll throw it up for you now. You can see how many of them are taunting me as we speak. But it didn't remain there. It's a game that I can't help but come back to. And one, that's a sign that it's a good game, and I'm going to explain why it's a good game, obviously, why I think it's a good game. People have talked about this game a lot, as you might imagine. But I'm also going to think about how impactful the game was actually on me a little bit, what it does so well, why it does it well, where we can find things like it, if we can even find things like it, and maybe a little bit on the communism in the game. You knew if you clicked on this I was going to talk about the communism. How could you not know that? But we're going to talk about the communism in the game. But I do want to warn everyone up front, there will be some spoilers. I'm going to try and leave out as much of the end game as possible. I'm not going to touch it. I'm just going to try and move around it and not tell you anything about it. But there will be some spoilers, so just, okay? Go play the game. Come back. Or if you don't mind spoilers, just stick around. But let's get started. Also, throughout the review, I'm going to have clips of the game from my stream and some that I've had to take off my stream, to be fair, because Twitch has started deleting my VODs even sooner than it was before, which is a bit irritating because I had a lot of footage saved up on there. But that's me learning my lesson. But there will be some footage. If you want to catch me playing these games live, twitch.tv/SKTheCrusader. That's where you will find me playing at least once a week. I will be playing the games that I review here. So if you want to know what the next review is, go check it out. If you want to know what the next review is, go check it out. At its core, Disco Elysium is a tabletop RPG. It is almost the perfect distillation of tabletop RPG mechanics into a video game, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit. But that is our starting point, and in the game you play the role of, that's kind of it, right? When you start the game, you're greeted by the screen that allows you to determine your stats. Again, it's a tabletop RPG. What do you want? And by the way, picking your stats slightly incorrectly can lead to arguably some of the funniest game overs in any game. Like I have genuinely watched a friend of mine on Twitch play this game and die from a heart attack because they were sitting on a really uncomfortable chair, which I have to say is an incredibly funny way to meet your end. And when you start the game, you are greeted by the void. And you are spoken to by your reptilian brain and your limbic system. But you don't know who you are. You only know that you're in the void. And you crave oblivion. And you hear something about an ex-wife. But you're in oblivion. You're in the void. Those of you who have had, let's say, excessive nights out might be familiar with the sensation of the void. So, after the void, you're confronted by the aftermath of what I would describe as, well, either it was a very good or very bad night or series of nights, and, well, you'll be able to guess as you play through the game which of it might have been. And as I said, this game is a tabletop RPG, and you can tell it is because the game early on presents you with a series of checks. And one of the things it does really well about the checks and the way it captures this atmosphere of being a tabletop RPG is it shows you the dice rolls, and it shows you it clearly in the form of dice in front of you, right? You can see whether you got 2 6s or 2 1s. I've seen far too many 2 1s. I'm beginning to think the game might be cheating me, but especially with visual calculus checks. But anyway, I'm not mad about it. Right? This is the place where I want to make my first comparison. A lot of people compare Disco Elysium to Planescape Torment, which I have to admit, and maybe people will get mad at me, maybe not. I haven't played it yet. Which I guess means when I go back to play it, I'll be able to compare it to Disco Elysium, I suppose. But the comparison I actually want to make with a game that I've actually played is Baldurs Gate. Now, I think that's an apt comparison because Baldurs Gate is also a game based directly on tabletop RPGs. It's a D&D game, right? So it borrows directly from that. And the idea of Baldurs Gate, and maybe we'll do a video about a game that's similar to Baldur's Gate, is it streamlines the tabletop RPG elements, right? It does the roles behind the scenes. Well, kind of behind the scenes. It's not explicitly shown to you in the form of dice appearing before you, right? Baldur's Gate itself was a very, very important game for RPG video games. It is credited, in some cases, with basically injecting new life into a format that many thought had run out of road. And it spawned what I'd argue is a style of RPG video game, which Disco Elysium itself doesn't belong to. Disco Elysium plays against it in a lot of ways. It upends it. And in trying to do that, I think it surpasses it, right? Think about in Baldur's Gate, right? What is your primary mode of peril in Baldur's Gate? Your primary mode of peril in Baldur's Gate is you might die in a combat encounter, right? Now, in most tabletop RPGs, that is also a significant issue for you, right? You could die in a combat encounter. Now, in Disco Elysium, there isn't a mechanical focus on combat. Everything is 2d6s, you pass or you fail against the difficulty of the check. That's it. Now, that's not to say there's no violence or acts of violence. You can do all sorts of things that are violent. You can kick a racist in the head. I would say that's a pretty good choice to have available to you, but it's not. There's not a separate mechanic for combat, right? It is just 2 dice rolls. He either catches your fist or you catch him off guard, right? Them's your 2 options. Of course, there's always the option in that particular case of internalizing his weird race science, but we'll be talking about that in a bit. The thing it does well with the checks, incidentally, is it makes failing incredibly fun. I don't know how many of you watching this will play D&D or any old tabletop RPG, right? It doesn't have to be D&D, there's a world beyond it. But how many of you have had a really, really good DM or GM who just makes a natural one the funniest thing that could possibly happen? And not like in a sort of clownish way, but just in a sort of like way that makes you feel like risking it is worth it. There's a narrative value to taking risks. You are rewarded for failure as well as success. And that's something that Disco Elysium captures really well. It really captures the essence of what makes a tabletop RPG game really, really fun. The game is narrated by, yes, a disembodied voice, of course, who, by the way, their voice is fantastic. And a lot of the voice acting in the game is fantastic. I'm, by the way, reviewing the final cut here, which has a full set of voice acting for it. Basically, every character is voiced, every bit of every bit of the character's tortured psyche is voiced. All of it is there. And I think, by the way, that was a significant improvement. I think that some of the criticisms of the game before would have involved how much reading there is. And I say this as someone who enjoyed reading it, even though, as we've established, I'm not a strong reader. But there's the disembodied voice, but there's also various parts of your main character's personality, ranging from his sense of empathy, who absolutely fucked me in my stream playthrough because I ended up, because of my empathy, ended up doing pickup artist nonsense, which I have to say, empathy really letting the team down there. But you can go from his empathy to physical instrument, which is a representation of the character's sort of physical prowess. I don't know why I did that, like I have a particularly high physical instrument rating. All the way to this aspect of his personality, which after multiple playthroughs, I've had the bulb turn on. I'm like, this is it. And it's Shivers. And Shivers opens up the world in such a brilliant way that if you went into it blind, as I did initially, of course, you could miss out on so many things if you don't have Shivers. That doesn't mean that the game is a lesser experience for it, which, by the way, it's not. It's still a tremendous experience, with or without, or whatever you pick. Again, failing is still fun. It just means that some doors are left closed, some doors can be opened. That's all it is. And either way, you can still make your way through the game in a rewarding way. The game places you in the middle of a labour dispute between the Dibardieres Union, I don't know, I hammed up the Frenchness of that a little bit, and the Wild Pines Corporation, immediately dropping you into what is essentially a political dispute. The game takes place in Martinez in Revachol, which was once upon a time a revolutionary hotspot where the revolution has failed. And that's one of the main themes throughout the game: failure. Your character, as you play the game and find out more about him, it's almost a perfect human embodiment of failure. Martinez and Revachol is almost like a perfect geographical identity of failure. It's like if I took a failure and preserved it in amber, it would look like Revachol. And every ideology has had its day in Revachol, and every single ideology has catastrophically failed. The other theme is more a question, but it was one that I kind of found myself asking as I played it. Can people change? And can a person change the world around them? This combination of asking whether people can change, this overwhelming sense that not only are you a failure, but the world you exist in has failed. The rampant substance abuse your character takes part in, or took part in, it depends on what you decide to do, all the way to the fact that we have access to his sort of inner monologue. I guess it's less an inner monologue and more a conversation between contradictory elements of his personality. But it immediately made me think of Bojack Horseman, particularly the episode Stupid Piece of Shit.
You're a real stupid piece of shit. But I know I'm a piece of shit. That at least makes me better than all the pieces of shit who don't know they're pieces of shit. Or is it worse? Breakfast. Oh, I don't deserve breakfast. Shut up. Don't feel sorry for yourself. What does that do? Get breakfast, you stupid fat ass. These are cookies. This is not breakfast. You are eating cookies. Stop it. Stop eating cookies and go make yourself breakfast. Stop it. Don't eat one more cookie. Put that cookie down. Do not eat that cookie. I can't believe you ate that cookie.
Which, I mean, yeah, like, that is, if you want sort of a cartoon Disco Elysium, I guess there it is. It's Bojack Horseman. But the question Bojack Horseman asks, or at least asks, Bojack Horseman literally asks this, you know, is it too late to change, right? And in the case of your main character, as you sort of find out, because he's an amnesiac cop, after all of the substance, after his wild night, he is an amnesiac cop, that even the amnesia can't stop the fucking rotten core of the character coming out. You know, the pickup artist stuff. He explains something called the cock carousel to the bartender. Sorry, I shouldn't call him the bartender. The manager at the hotel that he wrecked, called the Whirling in Rags. And that's how I would summarize Disco Elysium. A very political, in the best way, by the way. I mean this in the best possible way. Synthesis of Bojack Horseman, the best parts of a tabletop RPG experience, and the sort of energy that Baldurs Gate gave to the genre of RPG games. It's the perfect, almost perfect synthesis of it. Before we dive into our main character and the other main character, I wanted to think a little bit about how the game treats ideologies, right? It almost treats them all kind of like a joke, but it treats them all in a joke differently, right? For example, if you make your protagonist, who I've been very careful not to name because he's somewhat between names, into a fascist, right? The game treats the option of becoming a fascist like you're a joke. And the fascists in the game are comical characters, like they're clowns. It's easy to imagine sort of fascists in their sort of final form. You know, let's not think too hard about that. But it's easy to imagine them as sort of like a ruthlessly organized and capable group of people who are singularly focused on seizing power and exercising it to crush the people they think are causing their society to crumble before them. And the truth is that fascists look more like the racist lorry driver saying "Welcome to Revachol" to you, right? You know, the shit-eating, smug prick who thinks he's being clever, who thinks he's not just a racist, he's read books, which makes it okay, apparently. Ooh, that's fine then, isn't it? But in all seriousness, if you try and get your main character, the protagonist, to internalize one of the other like main fascist assholes in the game, which is a very, very large gentleman called Jean-Luc Measurehead, which I have to say, that name is a choice. It's one of the funniest things in the game is the idea of Jean-Luc Measurehead. But like, confronting Measurehead, you have two choices. One, you can kick the shit out of him because he's a fascist. That you would think a game made by communists might leave it there, right? You simply physically confront and defeat the fascists. That's how you break their movement, right? But the game offers you another choice. It offers you the choice of internalizing his race science. Now, that option is very funny. It's sort of difficult to say because it shouldn't be funny, but it's very funny watching your character like actively make himself really fucking stupid. And of course there's always another option, which is because you need to convince Measurehead to either let you past into the Union offices, or you know, you beat him in a physical confrontation. But you can just go around. Like, you don't have to do any of that, right? It's all optional. Now, that's just an example of how they treat fascism. If you make your character a fascist, or really any ideology, you eventually get this sort of all-encompassing political quest that you need to go on, and it depends on which of the four main ideologies you decide to align yourself with. There's also the Ultraliberals, right? These are your real scumbag capitalists. The Ultraliberals in the game are represented by, oh Dios mío, a liberal, Joyce Messier. Now, she is an incredible antagonist, an incredibly written antagonist, because she is almost entirely self-aware of her position in society and what the people she aligns with have endorsed and done. And it's kind of refreshing because a lot of people who align with the real world equivalent of ultra-liberal are some of the most oblivious motherfucking people I've ever met. And Joyce herself is the negotiator for the Wild Pines Corporation, and there is a fantastic example of the game talking about and understanding ideologies. If you have made your protagonist internalize the idea of communism and you ask her for money. One, you know, the socioeconomics of communism in the game, called Mazovianism, it approves of the idea of you taking money from the rich. Very vulgar understanding of it, but yes, it would more or less approve of that. But your psyche claps back at you basically and says, doesn't this make it all the more humiliating to grovel? It's like, you think your communism can shield you from this? And it cuts deep. In fact, for a lot of people, the summary of this game is, I'm in this picture and I don't like it. And that's a great experience, and it kind of shines in very specific interactions for each person. But that one in particular, as someone who has to exist on the capitalist platforms and then talk about, hey, go to my Patreon and also have a day job. Not that I'm wearing thin on that front. Anyway, but also have a day job. It is a bit grating, the contradiction. And the game does a good job of pointing out contradictions like that. One of the other ideologies, obviously, in the game is communism. Now, I love a bit of communism, me. You know, very famously a big fan of the old communism. But the game is extremely hard on communists. And it's hard on communists from a place of understanding and love. But it is brutal on communists. It represents communism as failure, just utter, profound, repeated failure. Even the people who are supposed to be on your side, right? The people who, you know, like the trade unionist and the trade union leader. If you're a communist, you would think, well, might we align with each other, right? But even if you, as the player character, decide to espouse a perfect, ideal form of communism, the game does, by the way, challenge you on this and say, well, you know, how far are you willing to go for communism? Or really any of the ideologies, but I've only really played as a communist, so I can only speak to the communist experience. Like, how far are you willing to go? Are you willing to kill 4 million people? 40 million people? 400 million people? And when you internalize, or are offered the opportunity to internalize, what it calls Mazovian socioeconomics, it basically taunts you with, oh yeah, let's start the purges, and your character can react like, wait, no, I didn't want to sign up to any purges. Like, it's too late, you've signed up to it. And while that's a lampooning of liberal critiques of communism, it still cuts deep sometimes, and this game finds a way of cutting deep. The final ideology in the game is moralism. Now, I guess I should talk about the Moralintern a little bit. So the Moralintern are the people who have been put in charge of Revachol after the revolution was crushed. The Ultraliberals and the Moralists came to an understanding, and the Ultraliberals made bank, and the Moralists got the land. Which, I don't know what that's like. But the Moralintern and moralism represents an amalgamation of centre-left and centre-right politics. And in fact, the main character who represents moralism is your partner, Kim Kitsuragi. Now, unfortunately, the Moralintern is an organization whose entire basis is to keep things the same, much like what centrism is in real life. And through Kim, it treats centrism as an ideology that seeks solely to observe and not change. And yeah, it's a joke to do that, right? What I'll do here is I will leave you with the in-game description of each ideology so you can see how it treats each ideology. So I'll go and put those clips in now, and you can see how the game describes the ideology to you and how irreverent it is of all of the ideologies.
Kingdom of Conscience. The Kingdom of Conscience will be exactly as it is now. Moralists don't really have beliefs. Sometimes they stumble on one, like on a child's toy left on the carpet. The toy must be put away immediately, and the child reprimanded. Centrism isn't change, not even incremental change. It is control over yourself and the world. Exercise it. Look up at the sky, at the dark shapes of the coalition airships hanging there. Ask yourself, is there something sinister in moralism? And then answer, no. God is in his heaven. Everything is normal on earth. Indirect modes of taxation. Turns out those Financial Oversight Committee gangsters stuffed millions of hard-earned dividends away in the last place anyone thought to look, the hearts and minds of everyday Revacholians. You need to spread that deregulation gospel to the people. Tell them about that foreign fair tax. Preach that 98% gross burden. Preach it, preacher man. Set the brothers free. Taxes are racist. Revacholian nationhood. The Revacholian state will be a serene place. You should get a drink. A beautiful, serene place of mystery and peace. It will not be a place for women to infect with their frailty and hysterics, or where the Seminoles will be allowed to wear their pants around their ankles. All of that will go once you get a drink. The socialist professors at the École Supérieure will be fired. The editors of Trompe le Monde will have to beg in the streets. You'll pour beer into their begging hats and laugh. You should get a beer. Mazovian socio-economics. 0.000% of communism has been built. Evil, child-murdering billionaires still rule the world with a shit-eating grin. All he has managed to do is make himself sad. He is starting to suspect Krasmezov fucked him over personally with his socio-economic theory. It has, however, made him into a very smart boy with something like a university degree in truth. Instead of building communism, he now builds a precise model of this grotesque, duplicitous world.
I want to think now about our main character and the other main character. I always play Harry, and I'm going to tell you his name now. I always play him as a communist, and playing him as a communist it's a challenge, right? And it's not a challenge because the game makes it harder if you're a communist, although you do see reaction everywhere if you internalize communism. But communism itself in the game, in particular, comes in for quite a serious beating because it is a particularly failed ideology in the setting. And Revachol itself is a symbol of failure. Like I said, every single ideology has come in and every single one has essentially failed. But Harry himself, when he becomes a communist, wants to be the big communism builder, as do we all, really, right? We would love to be the big communism builder, but what happened, right? And what happens? So what happened in the game when the communism builders got together was the revolution was crushed and the communists were all bulldozed into mass graves, which is a disaster, right? It's an indictment of the ideology in a lot of ways in the setting. A lot of people will look at it in game. A lot of the characters will look at it and go, well, I mean, you tried, you failed, and I can't believe there's any more of you left. And by the way, you do not meet many explicit communists until quite late in the game, really. So you are, in essence, the last communist, and it does cut deep in a lot of ways being the last communist. And playing Harry as a communist really drives home this idea of failure, because as it describes communism, only 0.000% of communism has been built, but who knows? Maybe with your help, it will be 0.001%. And that is a summary of the failure at play, right? Because one, Harry himself, despite being a communist and a cop, which by the way is an interesting thing to reconcile, but they reconcile it by making Harry a despicable piece of shit. And by the way, that's not a contradiction in terms, right? He can be a communist and a terrible piece of shit. That doesn't, being a communist doesn't mean you have to be nice or good. Harry is very much a character who is a fucking abysmal piece of work, a horrible piece of work. He is capable of absolutely disgusting acts, and you play those acts, and the game makes you sort of complicit in those acts. It makes you feel complicit because you can hear the different bits of him encouraging you, discouraging you, pushing you in one direction, pushing you away from one. And Harry himself is this terrible, broken character with a past that you reveal as you go, this amnesiac slowly coming to terms with who he is. But that's the thing. Change is the other theme here. Can you change? Can a person change? And for Harry, the answer is no. It's no. And that's kind of gutting, right? Because yes, you can sort of refuse to do substance abuse, you can refuse to drink, but the game does offer you incentives to do that. Yes, there will be penalties for engaging in that sort of thing, but for mechanical purposes, it is better for Harry to be liquored up in a lot of cases. I don't know what to tell you. I went to confront Measurehead and I liquored myself up and I gave him a 360 spinning kick to the head, right? That is a problem for the player, because the player will try to apologize for the things that Harry's done instinctively the first time you play. Harry is such a piece of shit that you'll be like, oh, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. And then your cop archetype, which the game will assign you, will become, well, you're the sorry cop now. You apologize and you apologize. I always end up being the superstar cop. It's just more fun to delude yourself like that sometimes. And the thing with Harry is that he can't change. And that lack of change is represented quite early on. Because how does someone know to say certain things, right? Even in the case where you have, if you thought like he had completely erased what he was before, right? That the partying and the drinking and all of this stuff had so successfully wiped his memory that he was a complete blank slate. How does Harry know to, talk about the cock carousel with Gart? How does he know to do that? You don't encounter any material regarding a cock carousel up until then. You just up to Gart and say, ladies, right? Cock carousel. Oh, In a lot of ways, Disco Elysium kind of makes the point that the awfulness is inside you. It's that Bojack Horseman feeling of it all, where Todd goes, you are everything that's wrong with you, right? Harry can blame it on the stuff that's happened in the past, and he may not necessarily have a bad case to blame it on that, but also he is everything that's wrong with him, and no amount of altering his mind chemically will erase that. The horribleness is embedded within him, and that's a neat way of reconciling how he can have these lofty ideals. He wants a dictatorship of the proletariat. He wants to be the big communism builder. He doesn't necessarily want to do bad things, but he's a bad person who is compelled by years and years and years and years and years of doing bad things to just embrace the ugliness inside him. There's a quote in the game. He doesn't want to get better. He wants to get worse. And that's a great summary of Harry. And you can try, as the player, to just keep him level. You can't ever really significantly improve him. you can keep him level. And even that feels like an almighty ordeal, and even that can be an increase in the challenge of the game. There are, of course, many interesting characters, but there is one in particular I want to talk about, which is Kim Kitsuragi. He is the straight man to whatever the fuck Harry is meant to be. No one really knows how to quantify Harry, but Kim Kitsuragi is cool, composed, professional, capable, everything that you're not. He knows where he is, he knows what things are, but also he's a filthy moralist. The thing that summarizes him as a centrist is him constantly saying that he doesn't really have an opinion, and that your opinions don't reflect that of the RCM. Kim is a perfect companion to Harry. It couldn't have been any other character. Imagining it as any other character. Now, admittedly, you might be able to get another companion a bit later on. Again, not going to spoil that particular bit, but Kim is a perfect reflection, a mirror image of Harry. And that's why they work so well. As the game's narration points out to you, he is your half-brother. And you get that sense as you play through it, and as the relationship develops between the two characters. Now, I suppose since I have a bit of time, I will address some other characters that I find a little interesting. René Arnaud, well, he's a fascist, really. He's another one of the fascists, but his position on Revachol as a whole is always very interesting to me, because he really longs for the days of kings, but every single one of the fucking kings, which he freely admits, by the way, as you talk about it with him, were fucking terrible. But at least they were kings. Or Everard Clare, the manipulative, slimy, corrupt trade union leader. A real, type of leftist that's long gone from the world, at least in significant numbers. Or, I already mentioned Measurehead, who's a fantastic and interesting character, especially because you get to kick him in his head, which I find really great. Kuno, an absolute legend of a character. Shame that I think the one bad choice they made in the final cut was replacing the voice for Kuno, changing the voice for Kuno. The old one was much more grating and much more irritating, which was the whole idea. Joyce Messier, we talked about her. Fantastic character. A self-aware liberal. Who knew such a thing could exist? None of us knew that. Even the scab leader, outwitting the scab leader is great. The Hardy Boys, fantastic embodiments of union enforcement. The two kids who are staring at Kim's motorcar and you taking their jackets is probably one of the funniest interactions in the game. There's also, a chance for Harry to maybe go on a little date, which, given what he's been through, But the fact that I remember all these characters, these are just scratching the surface. There's a lot of characters, and there's a criticism of the game, which is that characters can feel like filler, and acts can feel like filler, like they're there to fill time. But nothing is really just there to fill time. At worst, you get a bit more of an outline of the world which Harry inhabits. Other times, and I didn't realise this, so I had persistently been failing the visual calculus check to count the number of distinct footprints leading up to a particular bit of the crime scene. Now, I was very frustrated, went into the trade union office and you tried to dial a random number, which I did. And because my shivers was high enough, I got a sort of sense of the world, and that sense of the world improved my chance of actually identifying the number of footprints. And it finally, after something like 4 attempts, came off for me. Nothing is completely pointless in the game. Nothing is filler. And the game remembers the little details. If you, for example, decide to make up your own name and fail, you can be Rafael Ambrosius Costo, and Kim will refer to you as Detective Costo, which, great. I can't see why your brain would pick that name, but I guess that's why that's a failure, right? The game remembers small details like what you're wearing. For example, when I at some point had discovered my little police ledger, I had stood in the halogen lights and I was talking to Kim about the nature of police work and suggested that maybe what Harry needed was a hobby. And because I was wearing the gardening gloves, because I forget to take off the gardening gloves, and also because +1 interfacing is nice, what can I say? Because maybe you can take up gardening, you have the gloves for it. Little details like that bring the game to life. A true masterpiece of design, by the way, in almost every way. The conversation trees must be absurdly complicated for this game. I'd love to actually take a proper look at them. But it's to the developers' credit that they managed to, one, handle all of these different trees properly, and two, managed to find the room to include details like the rubber gloves, which I'm not wearing. I don't know why I waved my hands about there. I wanted to reflect here on whether the game actually impacted me. I want to say, when I'm thinking about the impact of the game on me, it's important to understand that the game is interpreted and experienced differently by players. You will have your own interpretation and feelings about Disco Elysium, and you should tell me in the comments what you thought of the game and what it made you feel and think, because it's actually very interesting to see how people interpret and understand it. This fact that it is interpreted and understood differently by people is almost a perfect reflection of Martinez in Revachol itself, because you, through playing the game, get a variety of perspectives on the same events, the same places. You know, René Arnaud's feelings about the revolution are actually quite different from the feelings of, say, Joyce Messier, even though you might think that as a royalist and an ultraliberal there might be a bit more common ground there than they care to admit. Joyce seems to feel genuine regret at what had to happen, but it was just business. Whereas René remains in his old age outraged that the communards came and deposed their good, sweet, beautiful king and destroyed the suzerainty, which I personally don't feel particularly strongly about. But the core themes of the game that I mentioned, failure and whether you can change, and whether you can change the world, those are important questions, actually, because as we go through life, as we experience things, we change our minds. And I've changed my mind. I've changed, right? If I look back on myself as a 17-year-old dipshit, and I'll put a picture up of him somewhere, that guy is really different from me. Not just in appearance, and not just because he's been ridiculously has short hair. Terrible choices we made when we were young. But the change is real, but not all of the change is for the better. You might well think I'd look better with short hair. I challenge you to tell me that in the comments, but you might well think that was a look that suited me better than this look now. But the idea of failure is something that we all have to confront, and there are all sorts of other themes in the game. Loss, regret, the fact that life, it has a way of chipping away at you, of bringing you down, of changing things, of making you less than you were. And Harry is almost a perfect embodiment of what would happen if everything was chipped away from us, and if we decided to medicate it by diving into a hole of, furious ideological commitment, which I have, by the way, but also a significant component of Harry's destruction is born of his substance abuse, the depression. When I saw the options that related to depression, that related to his depression, to how he reacted to it, it was at once reassuring and uncomfortable. It felt familiar, but to see it on a character as obviously ruined as Harry is at times in the game, it's discomforting, but compelling. And I kept on with it. And I don't regret keeping on with it. I think this game is a fantastic game. An amazing game. And as the title of this will reflect, an almost perfect game. But it did force me to look at myself in a lot of ways. And to confront myself. And to even think about what ideology is for in my case. You know, am I the big communism builder? Putting my shoulder against an impossibly big wheel, hoping to turn it 0.001% of the way there. Is that what I'm doing? Can I do it alone? No, of course not. I guess that's why I'm here. But it made me reflect strongly on myself. And I think that's something to be welcomed in video games sometimes. A lot of people will extol the virtues of books and stuff like that for making them reflect and think. Video games as a medium are capable of so much, and Disco Elysium could only have existed as a video game. It could only have had the impact it did as a video game if this was someone's tabletop RPG campaign. You know, well, in the case of this, it would be a one-to-one RPG campaign. An audience of one is no audience at all, really. And so, one, I'm glad the developers made this game. As unlikely as success would have looked on paper, it is good that they made it, and they made it well. It is clearly the product of love, blood and sweat and tears, and it is magnificent in how it came out. I can't turn away from it in a lot of ways. And each time I play it, I find new little details, and I'm just delighted by it. And the impact it's had on me is for the better. Being made to reflect on yourself by anything, as long as you're open to what it's showing you, is a good thing. And I think this game could show people a lot of other things. And with that, I think, on the note of the game being magnificent, I think I'm wrapping up now with the video done there. I hope you enjoyed that review of Disco Elysium. It was kind of rambly, and I struggled at times to put my thoughts together, but I thought it was important that I do this. I really wanted to get some thoughts out on the game. It's such a fantastic game. I enjoy it so much. But everyone, you might notice that I'm wearing a new shirt. It's a big iron shirt. There it is. Those of you who watched the first game review might be familiar with the big iron incident that occurred when my partner rather foolishly misunderstood the song Big Iron. Shirt is available on my shirt store. The link will be down below, along with all of my other links to all of my other cool things. But I do need to thank some patrons over on the Patreon. So, I guess they'll show up here, or I guess I'll make a fancy credit sequence. But, either way, you'll see it. And I particularly want to thank Drone Riff, Mercutio, Nauseum, and Kersley Scheider. They are my top tier subscribers. If you want the game reviews a day early, just the £1 tier is all you need, and you'll get them a day early, and you'll get my thoughts on stuff like Disco Elysium a bit earlier. And folks, with that, I'll see you next time.